Member from Huron, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to stand today to lend my voice to the debate on Bill 181. But before I do so, I'd like to go back and update my record from March 24th. And that was during a debate that we had with regards to the private members' initiative from Ottawa, Orleans, and her private members bill was to receive unanimous support to recognize the first two ladies that were ever elected into the Ontario legislature, and Agnes MacPhail and Mrs. Lockhart. And with that regard, during the debate, I mentioned that I grew up with a municipal office in my home until I was a teenager, and I remember very well everything, every nuance that's involved in a person being a clerk and treasurer and ultimately administrator for a local municipality. And I was very proud that day to share that my mother, Winona Thompson, was either the first or second woman ever to be named clerk to a municipal township in Huron County. And at that, I was hesitant. I said first or second because I had shot Mom an email very quickly, and she got back to me right after the debate. But I just want to make sure, because this is something that we need to celebrate. The first clerk ever named in the County of Huron, specifically for the township of West Wawanosh, was a dear family friend, Joan Armstrong, and Mom was the second clerk that was named in Huron County to the township of East Wawanosh. And it's really nice that to have a chance to celebrate this type of leadership and mentorship, because back home in Huron County, the retired clerks have a club where they get together for lunch once a month. And I'm sure they'll be talking about this, and they welcome people to their club on a regular basis. But there's a lot of camaraderie and a lot of pride that goes along with working and serving the people of local municipalities. And one thing, one thread that ties all of those people together, past and present, is the serving of the public and making sure democracy is upheld. And this is where I pull my link back into the debate for Bill 181, because democracy has to be upheld, and people really, truly need to have their say. And in that regard, I'd like to reflect on a comment that I just heard this past Saturday night. And it was a comment that came from the CEO of the Township of Morris Turnberry. And she's very concerned, Speaker, and I will share that concern in a second, but when the member, during his 2-minute hit, talked of, the member from Leeds Grenville, that is, during his 2-minute hit on the government debate, referenced the concern over the extended lame duck period, I couldn't help but transition that concept of lame duck over to this government, because what I heard from the treasurer of Morris, or the CAO now of Morris Turnberry, is that they're very concerned about this lame duck government because they're holding municipalities kind of hostage to their lack of follow-through. Education rates, education levies have yet to be set by this government, and it's holding up municipalities from finalizing their budgets. Honestly, if it's not one thing like further downloading or decreased funding, now they're holding them hostage to their lack of performance. Speaker, this government needs to pull up its socks and do right by people who are striving and pride themselves in working so well for their local municipal taxpayers. But again, we find another example, again, this government has yet to set the education levy for this year, and it's holding municipalities back from setting their budgets. Time and time again, a lack of performance and lack of prioritization is causing people in Ontario to be frustrated and not to be able to fulfill their responsibilities. But as we go back to take a look specifically at Bill 181, there's no greater responsibility than that of our democratic right of electing people. And we feel very strongly that the changes this government is suggesting to the Municipal Elections Act and the Assessment Act and the Education Act with respect to third-party advertising, campaign financing, compliance and enforcement, accessibility, the election calendar, voters list, eligibility to vote and run in municipal elections, and election administration, as well as ranked ballots, is a little heavy-handed, and it's taking us backwards, especially when they're proposing all of these changes without an opportunity for people to have their voice, to exercise their right through a referendum, for instance. And I think that we have to take time on our side as the loyal opposition to make sure municipal voices are heard in order to ensure that this bill accurately reflects what they need to run modern, accessible, democratic, and effective municipal elections. So I'd like to start by echoing what my colleague from Oxford, Ernie Hardeman, stated yesterday. And there are some beneficial aspects to this bill, but we are, however, concerned with key components that have the potential to ignore fundamental aspects of the democratic process. For instance, the electoral process is an important and intrinsic part of any democratic society. As such, whenever changes are proposed to Speaker to that process, our party firmly believes that serious and substantive consultation should be conducted. And I have said that on numerous occasions about numerous issues that have been perpetuated by this government. But most important to consultation on this particular issue is the need to allow the public a forum in which they can voice their opinion on that matter. And I'll touch a little bit more in detail later on that issue in my debate, because this Liberal government, which ran on a platform, ironically, of an open and transparent governance, has been failing the people of Ontario in this respect. And Bill 181 is just another long list, as I've alluded to. So there's three key issues that we would like to address, and I specifically during my time. The abolishment of the leave of absence exemption for volunteer firefighters who choose to run for municipal office, the continued practice by this Liberal government to leave the working out of critical details to regulations, and seriously, any time a government chooses to put the meat on the bones behind closed doors should cause everyone reason for concern. And thirdly, the concerning lack of public consultation that this bill allows for. We just heard from the member from Renfrew, Pembroke, Nipissing that people deserve to have their say, and I totally agree with that. And I'd also like to get on record for the people watching this debate at home exactly what this government is trying to propose with regards to a ranked balloting system. And I know our esteemed colleague from Oxford highlighted how the system worked yesterday, but it's a complicated method of voting, Speaker, and if we're going to have any sort of informed debate, we must ensure that everyone understands how this works. So I'm just going to go over that again this morning. So in a ranked balloting system, a candidate is required to get 50% of the vote plus one. When you receive your ballot on Election Day, the candidates will be listed on it in no particular order. As the voter, you then number them as 1, your most preferred candidate, 2, for your second preferred candidate, 3, for your third, and so on, down to your least preferred candidate. After the polls close, the number of times each candidate was selected as first choice is tallied up. The candidate with the least number of first-place votes is eliminated. And then the eliminated candidates' votes are then redistributed to the second-place choices on all of the ballots where the eliminated candidate was ranked first. This means that on a ballot where the first-choice candidate was eliminated, the second-choice candidate becomes the preferred candidate. The ballots are recounted and the process continues until a candidate receives the required number of votes to win. And again, as a kid, I remember the great effort and pride that went into pulling together the voters list and making sure they were distributed throughout the community, throughout the township, at the community hubs, so to speak, so that everyone could ensure their name was indeed on the voters list. Because back in that day, people knew it was a privilege and an honour to vote, to cast their opinion as to who they wanted to see in their municipal leadership, their municipal council. And I hope with all my heart that that privilege and that honour is sustained as we look to a voter turnout, be it municipally, provincially or federally, that seems to be dwindling through the years. But looking at my riding of Huron-Bruce, I'm very proud that in 2011, Huron-Bruce had the greatest voter turnout in the provincial election, and in 2014, it had the second highest voter turnout in that particular provincial election. And I just want to applaud the good folks from Huron-Bruce at this time for their efforts to get out and exercise their voice and vote, and I want to encourage them to continue to do so. But it gets a little grey, Speaker, when this government starts introducing the concept of a ranked ballot system, and it very well could be confusing to some and turn them off, and we don't want to do that. And we want to ensure that, as was pointed out yesterday, we want to ensure that people embrace this new approach to electing a municipal council. And while it appears that this government may have conducted some consultation to implement a ranked ballot system, it appears that there has been a lack of consultation on whether or not what system specifically would be preferred. And you know, I'm not sure about the rest of the MPPs in the House today, Speaker, but I know the realities are in my home municipality of South Bruce and across the riding, and I would dare say there's probably a theme throughout Ontario. We can't make it more difficult for individuals to throw their hat in the ring to run for municipal council. We can't make it more difficult to encourage people to come out and vote. In many instances in our wards, people are being acclaimed. And to me, that's a little bit of a worry, because I would hope, given the direction this province is currently heading under this government, I would hope more and more people would want to be engaged, would want to embrace the opportunity to try and make a difference and to correct the path that we're on. But again, we're finding that there's a trend where acclamations are probably more the norm than not. And we don't want to confuse and make things more difficult. And we'll talk about that. The example of, yeah, exactly. And the example of how this particular bill addresses the interest of a volunteer firefighter to throw their hat into the ring is a perfect example of how they're making it more difficult. But the Toronto Star had an article written by David Ryder back in May 2015, and it's interesting. There's the conclusion to all of that, after I read that article, is that there's nothing impartial about dictating which electoral system is best for the people without consulting them. And I mentioned volunteer firefighters, and I want to jump into that in a little bit more detail. A few months ago, one concern we had in the PC party is the impact on first responders. And under this bill, the leave of absence exemption for volunteer firefighters will be removed. Speaker, this means that if someone in this capacity wants to run for office, they would be unable to serve in their community for a minimum of 13 weeks. And again, Speaker, this just shows an absolute disconnect this government has with the realities of rural Ontario. Our fire departments, thankfully, in all the communities in my riding, are supported by a wonderful team of volunteer firefighters. And they have their families to care for, they have their daily jobs that they go to. But honestly, if that team of volunteer firefighters is finite, and if somebody would like to throw their hat into the ring for consideration for municipal council, to have them leave that volunteer fire department for 13 weeks will leave a hole in our volunteer teams, and that's a concern. It's something that probably was completely overlooked by this government when they rushed the legislation and their consultations in that regard. I know that in the riding of Huron-Bruce, many of our fire stations, as I mentioned, are comprised of volunteers. The Central Huron Fire Department relies on 20 volunteer firefighters. Blythe District Fire Department consists of 22 volunteer firefighters. The Ripley Huron Fire Department is staffed by 10 volunteers. The Lucknow District Fire Department is served by 24 volunteers. The Walkerton Fire Department relies on 29 volunteer firefighters, and the Teeswater Fire Department is comprised of a great team of 22 individuals that like and are proud to call Teeswater home. But again, they're on rotating teams, and by thinking they might like to make a difference at a municipal level would remove them from that team and remove them from their camaraderie and their commitment to keeping our community safe. And I'm concerned that, what are they going to do? They're going to either keep people away from pursuing an interest in serving their communities at the municipal level as a potential councillor, or our volunteer firefighters and our fire departments will suffer and not have as many volunteers to call upon. And it's not right, sir. This government, as I said, has just proven themselves to be yet again disconnected from the realities of rural Ontario. Now let's talk a little bit about regulation, Speaker. In the PC party, we also have concerns that many of the important details of this bill are left to regulation and not subject to parliamentary process and public scrutiny. It makes me think of Bill 172. A lot of the cap-and-trade scheme, if you will, that this government is introducing will be achieved through regulation. And I can't stress how many businesses, how many organizations are very anxious and worried about what regulations will do to them and their businesses and their future, for that matter, as they define this scheme behind closed doors via regulations. In fact, going back to Bill 181, whole sections of this proposed legislation could be overruled by regulation, despite having gone through the legislative process. Again, how democratic is that? Regulations defined behind closed doors, behind these closed government doors, will not be open to debate in the public forum as this wonderful chamber in the Legislative House of Ontario, but instead it will be decided upon by bureaucrats behind closed doors that have been given their lead by the minister or cabinet. And one example that specifically I want to outline today is section 41.1, subsection 6, and it states, if, in the opinion of the Lieutenant Governor and Council, it is necessary or desirable in order to further the purposes of this section and this Act, the regulation may vary the operation of any of the following provisions of this Act, or may provide that any of the following provisions do not apply with respect to a ranked ballot election. Following that, there are no less than 10 sections, subsections, and clauses, Speaker, that could be changed or entirely struck out at the whim of a regulation. And this should give everyone cause for worry. And the legislative process, as you know, Speaker, is in place to ensure that there is accountable, transparent government. And that's what this government across the floor stood on. That's what we heard about in the throne speech after we came back. And sadly, Speaker, there is absolutely no proof through the years and the last few months that this government is adhering to its own path of transparency and accountability. They have totally thrown that to the wind, and instead they're covering their backs, they're circling their wagons, they're closing their doors because they know they've failed Ontarians, and the only way forward is to continue to do things behind closed doors. The people of this province have a right to know the details of how they select their representatives municipally, and that should not change election year to election year simply because 3 ministers are able to sit in a room together and contrive a new approach. And Speaker, we've heard that people across Ontario and Canada are struggling to feel like their voice counts if that process is allowed to continuously change at the leisure of those who control the system. The good intentions to increase voter turnout will ultimately fail. And Speaker, that was one of the worries that I shared at the onset of jumping into this debate today. Public consultation is absolutely void on this government, Speaker. It doesn't matter whether it's the Green Energy Act. We just met with the Environmental Commissioner last week, and the member from Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, had a representative of a local municipality in her riding come forward and say they're actually redacting and disallowing the realities around noise. And then with regards to the industrial wind turbines, they're absolutely not allowing it, and then they have the nerve in an ERT to come forward with a position saying, well, there were no complaints, so, you know, noise. After they redacted and did not allow any discussion further on noise complaints with regards to industrial wind turbines, they said there were no complaints. It's shameful how this government is acting. Thank you.